Hey guys, it's towniesimbuilds here, and welcome back to another episode of The Sims 4 Real Lore. In this series, we dive into fascinating destinations from around the world, shrouded in history, mystery, and sometimes a little bit of spookiness. Today's episode explores the mysterious encounters of the Gray Man, a ghostly entity that has been seen by South Carolina residents for more than 200 years. While his inception and identity remain up for debate, many confirm that the Gray Man ghost has been viewed as a benevolent protector, warning locals of approaching storms and sparing their lives and homes in the process. Before diving into today's video, I do want to note that we will be covering topics regarding the supernatural and paranormal, so please keep that in mind while watching. Starting off our tale today, the apparitions of the Gray Man ghost are rooted in South Carolina's Pawleys Island, located on the southeastern coast of the United States. While there are discrepancies regarding the Gray Man's appearance, there are some consistent traits that witnesses have noted, shared by both residents and visitors of Pawleys Island over the course of the past 2 centuries. Normally, the Gray Man appears as a shadowy, partially transparent figure, adorned in a long greatcoat that some sources describe as a cloak. Some sources even compare his clothing to that of a pirate, with some stating that the figure appears legless. Unfortunately, there are no definitive reports indicating the exact appearance of the figure. His facial features, age, and ethnicity are all hazy and ambiguous. However, given the clothing, location, and time period, there is a general consensus that the Gray Man is an adult, likely Caucasian male, who lived roughly between the late 1700s and the early 1800s. Fortunately, due to more modern technology, there has been some alleged video footage of the Gray Man himself. One prominent example is a video clip examined by paranormal investigators Jim and Billy McKenzie, originally recorded in September of 2018. At this time, South Carolina was impacted by Category 4 Hurricane Florence. During a live stream of Hurricane Florence's landfall, the investigators noticed a light gray apparition of what appeared to be a man walking across an unnamed pier in Pawleys Island. Unfortunately, this footage has been met with skepticism, with some claiming it to be fraudulent. Others note that the exact location of the camera was also not confirmed to be Pawleys Island, further questioning the validity of the footage. However, many individuals who have experienced the Gray Man stand firmly behind the footage itself. Based on the reports of individuals who have encountered him, the Gray Man's interactions are extremely brief yet intentional. The Gray Man has been known to wave or beckon to individuals with his arms, with many reporting that he has been known to speak verbally to those in close proximity. Despite many accounts detailing his appearance over the past 200 years, the apparition of the Gray Man along the beach of Pawleys Island is also not a perennial occurrence. In fact, many locals confirm that he has only appeared during the days leading up to a major hurricane or tropical storm. These appearances would align with the Atlantic hurricane season, which runs roughly between June 1st and November 30th. Upon encountering and/or interacting with the Gray Man, witnesses who claim to heed his warning of an approaching storm reportedly leave the area, only to return and find their homes unscathed from natural disaster. This alleged supernatural intervention has led many to investigate the true story behind the Gray Man, and how he came into existence. However, his backstory has been highly debated to this day. Among locals, there are 3 varying accounts of the Gray Man's origins, with some theories holding less historical credibility than others. One of the more uncommon tales describes the Gray Man as a former Confederate soldier in the American Civil War. In line with his current lore, the soldier rode home from the battlefield, warning his family of an approaching storm that was heading directly to Pawleys Island. Reportedly, the family heeded the advice of the soldier, surviving the storm's impact. However, they would later receive a very mysterious telegram informing them of the soldier's death. The disturbing truth, however, was the fact that the soldier's death had occurred weeks earlier prior to his arrival at the family's home. This would entail that the soldier traveled to his family's estate as a spirit or ghost, if you will, warning them of the danger that was to come. Unfortunately, this variant of the tale is often disregarded, largely due to the fact that the American Civil War occurred from 1861 to 1865. Unfortunately, this also does not align historically with the Gray Man's first sighting in the year of 1822, which occurred decades prior to the war. Alternatively, some suggest that the ghost is the original owner of the Pelican Inn, a man by the name of Plowden, Weston. According to multiple sources, Plowden came from a rich, prominent family that amassed their wealth through rice plantations, which unfortunately at this time were sustained by both African and African American slaves. Throughout his childhood and adolescence, the Weston family used their wealth to provide Plowden with a highly proper education, including the hiring of a private British tutor, a temporary relocation to England for further schooling, and eventually enrollment in Cambridge. While at Cambridge, Plowden would meet his future wife by the name of Emily Esdale, whom he would eventually marry and live with back on Pawleys Island in South Carolina. Originally, the Hagley plantation was gifted to the couple by Plowden's father. However, the couple also sought to build a summer home away from the plantation itself. This summer home was intended to be a place of escape, away from the plantation's uncomfortable climate and the work-related responsibilities. This would then lead to the eventual construction of the Pelican Inn, a two-story home that was crafted from locally sourced wood, transported onto the island. Now, I do want to note that the Pelican Inn was not originally a hotel, and likely received its name sometime afterwards. However, it would serve as a gathering place during the Civil War, where the young couple would provide food and entertainment for the Confederate soldiers. Throughout his life with Emily, Plowden became a prominent figure in the political and military sphere, transitioning from a historian and orator to a company commander of the Georgetown Rifle Guard. Unfortunately, his time would be cut short not long after the end of the Civil War. Upon contracting tuberculosis in service of the Confederate Army, he would eventually pass away in January of 1864. Due to his admiration for his wife, the loyalty to his men, and of course the dedication he had for maintaining the Pelican Inn, some locals have attributed Plowden Weston to being the Gray Man himself. However, many argue that the earliest sighting of the Gray Man in 1822 also does not align historically with Plowden's life. In fact, sources cite Plowden's date of birth to be August of 1821, which would have made Plowden a mere infant at the time of the sighting. As a result, there is one popular theory that is widely accepted. However, there is no clear confirmation of the Gray Man's identity. Based on this backstory of the Gray Man, an unnamed possible nobleman was on a long voyage home, returning to Georgetown, South Carolina from a trip overseas. His fiancée, also unnamed, awaited his return at their estate on Pawleys Island. The address of the estate, however, is also unknown. Some sources claim that on the day of the man's return, a storm was steadily approaching the island, hastening the man's return to his fiancée. This detail is also not confirmed, however, and it is said that the man had been in a great hurry upon arriving back in Georgetown. In order to arrive home sooner to greet his fiancée, the man supposedly decided to take a shortcut, riding his horse through the Pawleys Island marshes. Other sources claim that the man had dared his servant to a race back to the estate, which ultimately steered him off the main road in efforts to win. Unfortunately, the shortcut proved fatal when the man and his horse encountered an area of quicksand within the marsh. Unable to escape, both the man and his horse perished within the marsh itself. The servant, who was riding farther behind the man, witnessed the event, and in doing so shared the tragic news with the man's fiancée. Grieving from her lover's death, it is said that the man's fiancée strolled the beaches of Pawleys Island, a popular spot the two had once enjoyed when he was still alive. The young woman had been walking along the shore when she was met by a very chilling apparition that manifested seemingly out of nowhere. A gray, shadowy figure that bore a resemblance to her late fiancé appeared before her. However, the figure also brought a warning to the young woman, insisting that she was in danger and had to leave the island. Reportedly, the woman shared her mysterious encounter with her parents. Despite the bizarre circumstances of their daughter's account, her parents agreed to leave Pawleys Island, relocating to a second home further inland. By heeding the strange figure's advice, the young woman and her family would become the first lives saved by the Gray Man in the year 1822, as a massive hurricane would strike South Carolina not long after their evacuation. Impacting both Horry and Georgetown counties, the hurricane destroyed nearly all homes in the area, taking the lives of approximately 300 people. Reportedly, however, the young woman and her family returned to Pawleys Island to find their second home unscathed by the storm, a fate that was not shared by many of the homes and lives of neighboring residents. After making his first alleged appearance in 1822, the warnings of the Gray Man would miraculously continue to this day, for a period of almost 2 centuries. Similar to his first apparition, all sightings would occur before the arrival of a major tropical storm or hurricane. In a highly detailed account provided by the moonlitroad.com, South Carolina resident Phil Buchanan retells his encounter with the Gray Man back in 1954, the year of Category 4 Hurricane Hazel's impact. Based on his account, he had returned to his family vacation home on Pawleys Island, visiting the island on a trip with his wife and children. One morning during his stay, Phil decided to go for a stroll on the boardwalk, traversing along the shores of Pawleys Island. Finishing his walk, Phil was turning back to head to his family's vacation home when he experienced a very unsettling sensation, feeling another presence on the boardwalk. Reportedly, Phil noticed an odd gray figure in the distance, approaching him at an increasing pace. Uncertain as to whether the stranger intended to harm him, Phil walked briskly in an attempt to escape the figure. At some point, however, Phil came to a halt, turning back to address the man. Much to his surprise, Phil saw that the figure had stopped pursuing him, and instead stood in the sand of the beach overlooking the ocean. The figure would then turn to look at Phil, only to vanish completely. Phil was unable to locate the strange figure, and much to his shock, he was only able to identify his own footprints in the sand, and none in the direction or position of the figure itself. Based on his account, Phil returned to his family and mentioned the strange encounter. Despite knowing the local legend of the Gray Man, Phil was highly skeptical about its validity and proceeded to spend the day with his wife and children. However, not long after, a heavy thunderstorm would develop later that evening, taking out the power on the island and thus the power to the Buchanan vacation home. Unfortunately, the thunderstorm would proceed to worsen the following evening. With the power still out and strong winds putting pressure on the old house, Phil grew more uneasy about the significance of his encounter with the very odd figure, ruminating upon the legend of the Gray Man. Ultimately, Phil and his family decided to leave the Buchanan vacation home on Pawleys Island. Phil's decision, despite its delay, would arguably save the lives of his family, along with the structural integrity of the Buchanan vacation home. To the shock of Phil and his wife, they would soon learn that the harsh thunderstorms they had experienced were only a precursor to the devastation of Hurricane Hazel. Upon returning to Pawleys Island sometime after, Phil and his wife were in disbelief. While other houses had been completely destroyed by Hurricane Hazel, the Buchanan vacation home miraculously remained perfectly unharmed. South Carolina resident Arnie Love details his encounter with the Gray Man, decades later in the year of 1989, preceding the arrival of another dangerous Category 4 hurricane, Hurricane Hugo. Recalling the days leading up to the hurricane, Arnie relayed his fascinating encounter to Garden and Gun magazine. His account reads as follows. My parents had gone down to Pawleys to board things up, before Hugo. My best friend's husband stopped by on the way to Myrtle Beach for work. There was no car when he pulled up, but he saw my dad up on the lookout. Turns out Dad wasn't home. Who we thought was my dad, we now believe was the Gray Man. In the end, our house was spared. Interestingly enough, Arnie Love would not be the only individual to report a sighting of the Gray Man in 1989. A 1990 episode of the US television series Unsolved Mysteries revealed the story of Jim and Clara Moore, who recounted a very similar experience. Based on their retelling, the couple had spotted an unknown man walking the beach of Pawleys Island prior to Hurricane Hugo's landfall. Upon attempting to wave at the man, he then proceeded to vanish from the beach entirely. After Hurricane Hugo had passed, the Gray Man's lore held true. The couple's home remained virtually untouched, while the homes of their neighbors suffered heavy damages in contrast. Through the years, the Gray Man has proven to be a benevolent entity, offering an otherworldly protection to those who entrust in his warnings. With that said, the accounts shared in today's episode only scratched the surface of the many encounters from both South Carolina residents and visitors alike. However, there are questions that still linger. Why does the Gray Man remain on Pawleys Island? And why did he develop his eternal role as the protector of the island itself? Unfortunately, these questions remain largely unanswered, especially due to the highly debated origins of the Gray Man himself. For those who believe in the more widely accepted backstory, it is possible that the Gray Man is repeating the actions he took to save his fiancée and her family centuries prior. Given that the Pawleys Beach was a sentimental spot for the couple, this may also explain his attachment to this particular location, despite perishing in the marshes farther away from the beach where his spirit now resides. The Gray Man's ability to foresee catastrophic storms, however, is yet another mystery. Some versions of the Gray Man's backstory suggest that he was a former sailor, or, at the very least, carried some maritime experience. By observing fluctuations in cloud formations, wind, temperature, and even the behavior of coastal birds and animals, it is possible that the Gray Man could have foreseen inclement weather. This would also explain his constant surveying of the Pawleys beaches, which would allow him to warn passerbyers if a dangerous storm did, in fact, develop. His ability, however, may also be explained by a more supernatural, perhaps even psychic, explanation. Unfortunately, there is no evidence or research that would explain how this would be possible. While the Gray Man's presence brings more questions than answers, the mysteries of the Pelican Inn bring more possibilities to the Gray Man's true identity. Mrs. Eileen Weaver, a former owner of the Pelican Inn, recounts her own interesting experiences regarding paranormal activity. Her experiences were recorded in Elizabeth Huntzinger's book, Ghosts of Georgetown. Based on her accounts, Eileen recalled a particular day when she was baking in the Pelican Inn's kitchen. She was kneading a ball of dough when a strange woman appeared in the room beside her, wearing a very distinct vintage dress. Eileen reported that the woman appeared to be French, and oddly enough, she also wore a very disapproving expression on her face, as if she was unhappy with Eileen's baking. Eileen quickly realized that this woman was not a living person. In her words, Eileen stated, "You knew the features were not earthly, but they were clear." Similarly, a man wearing 19th century clothing once appeared right in front of Eileen. However, his apparition was supposedly brief, given that Eileen did not know any further details or interactions during this experience. Eileen's sister-in-law Gail recounted her own paranormal experiences as well, detailing an odd occurrence she had one day. One afternoon while cleaning the inn, Gail had taken a break in the main hallway area. Attempting to read a comic book, Gail was quickly interrupted by a strange series of tugs at the bottom of her shirt. Eerily enough, there was no person or animal in the hallway that could have been responsible for this. Frightened, she quickly left the comic book behind and returned to her cleaning duties. However, she would withhold this odd experience for some time. Upon contacting local historian Julian Bollock, Eileen was able to review a series of 19th century photographs. Attempting to identify the ghosts she and her family experienced, Eileen was able to make a clear identification, selecting images of Mr. and Mrs. Mazyk. Interestingly enough, Mr. and Mrs. Mazyk were cousins to Plowden Weston, the man that some identify as the true Gray Man. Based on historical records, the Mazyks operated the Pelican Inn for several years following the passing of Plowden Weston and his wife Emily. Despite this fascinating find, more questions do arise with Eileen's discovery. Is Mr. Mazyk the true Gray Man, or is he another spirit entirely that haunts the Pelican Inn with his wife? Given the fact that the Gray Man is not normally seen outside of the Pawleys Beach, this theory is certainly up for debate. However, the Mazyks continue to be a fascinating part of the Pelican Inn's haunted history, Gray Man or not. While the Gray Man's origins will never be truly known, his existence has been a part of South Carolina's folklore and history for several generations. His duty over the past 2 centuries has remained virtually unchanged, serving as a mysterious omen, but also a guardian to Pawleys Island. Whether he is believed to be fact or fiction, an appearance may be in order during the next turbulent storm. Alright guys, and that is a wrap on the mysterious Gray Man of Pawleys Island, South Carolina. As always, I hope you guys enjoyed learning about the lore behind this local legend and seeing the build come to life. As a quick note regarding the build itself, I do think I got the exterior of the Pelican Inn fairly close to its real-life incarnation. But, like always, there is usually a very limited amount of interior shots, and I also did not have an official floor plan to work off of. Therefore, this build is not 100% historically accurate, and I did take a little bit of creative liberty here. Just like always, this is still a no CC, no mod limited pack build, and will be available on the Sims 4 gallery as well. I'll leave you guys now with the final cinematic shots of the build, along with the final lot specs. And as always, this has been 𝗧𝗛𝗓𝗏𝗡𝗚 signing off. Thank you so much for watching, guys.